a question was staring at me in the face, and it was simply, what is the passion for which you live? And I had to think about that. What drives you? What is it that you get out of bed each day and strive on? And that's assuming you do get out of bed each day. What is it that dominates your thinking? What dominates your reading? And that's assuming you read. What makes your life tick? What is it that you really want to spend your money on? What passion do you carry in your heart? What is the most important thing in your life? Can you answer that question? What am I living for? If you're having difficulty identifying with those questions, think of it in the negative. What is it that if you lost it, if it was taken from you, would devastate you? Would make living not worth living? What would steal your joy? Last week we began looking at this wonderful short book of Philippians. And you might want to turn there if you're not in there already. Philippians chapter 1. And it's simply a letter that the Apostle Paul wrote to the church that he founded in Philippi. And I said that Philippians is the most joyful of all of the books in the Bible. We began differentiating between what happiness is and what joy is. Happiness is simply an attitude of satisfaction or delight based upon some present circumstance. And when your circumstance starts to change, so does the level of your happiness. It either increases or decreases depending what you're going through. Where joy, on the other hand, is something that is not fleeting. It is not something that is so tenuous. And it is not dependent on circumstances, the things that go on in your life. In the most general terms, joy is a deep down confidence that all is well. No matter what is going on in your life, no matter what tragedy, no matter what the difficulties are that you're going through, no matter what the problem is, if you are filled with joy, true joy, it's immovable. Joy is related to God. It is what Galatians 5 tells us. It's one of the fruits of the Spirit. Do you remember a few weeks ago when we were talking about vine and the branches, and the fruit that comes out of those branches is because of being in the branch of Jesus Christ. Joy is a fruit that comes from being in the branch. Now, the deeper that we travel into these pages of Philippians, the greater our understanding of joy should be. For the Apostle Paul demonstrates, he illustrates to us and embodies, I think, the greatest example of life in joy that's found anywhere else on the pages of Scripture. In this passage this morning, Paul teaches us it's not the circumstances in your life. It's not whether things are going well in your life or going very bad for you. It is the way in which you define life that will determine whether you stand or fall in this world. What is your definition of life? What is it that you're living for? I'm afraid that most people really don't stop and even think about that or even ask them that question. What is it that I'm living for? How do I define myself? But how you answer that will reveal the level of true joy that you have. Right. Listen to this carefully. This is a quote from John MacArthur that I was thinking about most of the week. He says, the measure of one's spiritual character, the measure of their spiritual strength, and the measure of one's spiritual maturity is what it takes to steal one's joy. Wow. That's pretty profound. In other words, whatever point that your joy starts to diminish, starts to go into bitterness, starts to go into some negativity or maybe a critical spirit, whatever that point is, when your joy is letting loose to the sullenness that's starting to creep into your life and joy starts to get pushed out of your life, that reveals the level of spiritual maturity that you have or don't have. It's amazing to look at the life of the Apostle Paul. Nowhere in Scripture do you ever see anything that's happening to his life, and we will see much of that as we go through Philippians. In fact, much more has happened to Paul than probably most of us in this room combined. But nothing depletes his joy.
Wow.
I think he got unhappy, but nothing depletes his joy. And the reason is, for a Spirit-controlled Christian should never come to the point in their life where joy is forfeited.
Amen.
In fact, for the Christian, the only thing that really can deplete the joy is sin in the life. So let's learn from the Apostle Paul, shall we? Let's begin with this. Point number 1. Life is hard.
Amen.
Maybe a better way to say it is there is a hardness to life. We know that, don't we?
Yes.
I know that each one of you knows somebody that just seems to glide. They just glide through life. It doesn't seem like anything touches them. Everything clicks. We all have someone like that. We start thinking, man, can life really be like that? My life is not like that. What is it? It's like a Facebook page. You got this family picture there. They're all wearing coordinated clothes. Powder blue shirt, white pants. They're standing on a beach. The blue Pacific Ocean's behind them. And what's it saying? Life is perfect.
Right.
Life is perfect. And what do we say? How come my family doesn't look like that? For most of us, life isn't really like that. It's difficult, and we don't even have matching clothes. Bad things happen to us. And some of those bad things, of course, we have caused, but many of the things, they just come at you. That's life. In fact, Jesus himself told us and warned us back in John 16:33, he said, in the world you will have trouble.
Yes.
Expect it. And you got to love Job. Job says, but man is born to trouble as sparks fly upward. Verse 12 of Philippians 1 says, now I want you to know, brethren, that my circumstances have... Now stop right there. Don't go any further. I want you to know, brethren, that my circumstances have... Do you see the concern? There's concern there. Paul is writing this letter to his friends who have become very, very, very concerned about his circumstances.
Right.
Paul knows this. And he knows that they are getting very discouraged and they are starting to worry. It's because they have started to hear about Paul's circumstances. So Paul writes this letter to tell them you don't have to be discouraged. You don't have to worry. What is it in Paul's circumstances that is causing this concern, this discouragement? It's interesting because Philippians really doesn't tell us a whole lot about Paul's situation. We just find out that he's joyful through it all. We have to go to Luke's book of Acts to really find out what's going on in Paul's life. And it's all there. You see, Paul always wanted to go to Rome. He always wanted to take the gospel of Jesus Christ to the very center of Europe, right smack in the middle of the great world empire at that time. And that was his great desire. In fact, at the end of his book of Romans, Paul writes, I want to come to Rome. And then I want to set up a base so then I can go to Spain. Paul is a planner. Paul is excited. And I think he is spending many nights with the with his notebook of papyrus, and he is planning, he's charting. He wants to go on the mission field. He's writing out his plans, and he's getting more and more excited to go there into the very center of paganism, right there in the center of that worldly empire, to share the gospel. Early in Romans, Paul wrote to the Romans, he says, I hope to have a very prosperous journey to come to you. Wow. Well, the journey happens, less the prosperity.
Right.
You can read all about it in chapters 21 through 28 of Acts. It's a great story. It starts out, Paul and someone else is at the temple in Jerusalem, getting ready for his big plans to kick off. And immediately the two of them are attacked by a mob accusing him of breaking some Jewish laws. It's a very serious accusation. There's several that are not real thrilled about his teaching of this man Jesus that had been recently put to death. They would have lynched him on the spot. They wanted him gone. But some soldiers and the soldiers' commanders, they got involved, and they take the two men and they protect Paul. They throw him into prison. Not because he did anything wrong, but to protect him from the mob. Chapter 22 of Acts, Paul's in prison. Now he's in Caesarea. That's where he ends up. And Caesarea was where the Roman garrison was stationed, so that was a good place for him to be in prison. Nobody knew what to do with Paul. He ends up staying in that prison for 2 years. Have your plans ever been put on hold? Have you ever been real excited about getting ready to do something, especially for the Lord, and it's on hold? While he was in prison, there was a plot to take his life. While he was there, he was daily insulted. He was daily shamed. There were, I'm sure, physical and mental things going on there. The government wanted to get rid of him. They didn't know what to do with him. Well, they did finally figure it out. They put him on a ship. Where did they send him? Rome. So eventually he boards this boat, this ship, and what happens? He gets shipwrecked. He had to swim for his life, Acts tells us. But he does get to Rome. That was his big ambition, right? Well, he gets to Rome, and he's thrown into prison for another 2 years. And that's a total of 4 years in prison, back to back. That was not his plan. I think I would be saying something like, hey, God, I'm trying to do your work.
Right.
Help me out a little bit, would you? He's at the height of his career. I mean, just think of all the good things that he could have done had he been allowed to do what he was planning to do. How many more churches he possibly could have planted. I think in many ways it's harder for Christians to actually go through the struggles and the hardness of life than it is for a non-Christian. Because if you don't believe in God, especially if you don't believe in a loving and caring God, you can just say, well, that's just life. That's just the way it is. That's how the molecules tumble. But if you believe in an all-powerful, all-loving God, as most of us in this room I'm sure do, and you start going through the stuff that Paul is going through, wouldn't you be wondering, why does God allow all this to happen? Yeah. Especially when it happens and it seems to derail his work. Like Paul, you give up your career, you might have left your family, you've left the normal comforts of just to follow Jesus. You go and you're planting churches, and then you get thrown into prison for 4 years. God, what are you doing? Life is hard, but here's my second point. And that is God achieves his purposes outside of and inside of our circumstances.
Yes.
In other words, God's purposes are going to happen. Our circumstances do not thwart God when he wants something done.
Yes.
In fact, he often gets it done using our circumstances. Many of you know the story of Jim and Elizabeth Elliott. Back in 1956, Jim and 4 other missionaries were killed by the very tribe that they were to be missionaries to and sharing the gospel with. And what are you thinking, God? If you know the story, years later, Jim's wife, Elizabeth, she goes back to the very tribe that killed her husband and started interpreting and translating and started to share the gospel with them. And she worked for many years among the Auca Indians. And eventually, many came to Christ through her. She wrote several books, and this is something that she wrote in one of her books. She says, Christians will very often find just what the Philippians found. Not only does God allow evil in general, but sometimes it seems like God allows evil and injustice to happen to the most strategic thing that God, you'd think, wouldn't possibly want to have happen.
Right.
Well, it was during those 2 years, the second of the 2-year terms in prison, that Paul wrote what has become known as the prison epistles. And Philippians, this letter that we're looking at, is one of those that he wrote in prison. Now think about that for a second. Would you say that those writings, which we have all of them right here, might have influenced the world since? I mean, it's amazing how God's word gets out in prison. Now, it had been at least 4 years. We know it's been at least 4 years since the church at Philippi had heard anything from Paul. And you could kind of see why they might be getting a little bit discouraged. They started to hear things about what might be happening to them. And Paul loved that church immensely, and they loved Paul immensely. And they're wondering what's going on. Is Paul okay? Is the gospel okay? Are we all on a sinking ship here? And to find out, the church sends a man. His name is Epaphroditus. He's a member of the congregation. They sent him to Rome to find Paul and to learn 2 things. They want to know, what is your condition, Paul? And what is the condition of the gospel? So they sent with Epaphroditus a bunch of money to help Paul out because they knew he must be needing support. And also just plain encouragement.
Right.
But they needed a report on what's going on here and what's happening. And they wanted word back from Paul himself. So Philippians, the little letter that we have here, is his response to that. Paul writes Philippians to answer those 2 main concerns that the church at Philippi had. And the letter is carried back to the church at Philippi. So Paul writes, he says, now I want you to know, brethren, that my circumstances, in other words, all of those terrible things that you've been hearing that have been happening to me, guess what? They have turned out for the greater progress of the gospel. In other words, in what appears to be a horrible reality, all of the stuff that has been happening to me in my imprisonment, I want you to see that it has turned out to be very, 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 very good. Why is it good? Because God knows what he's doing.
Amen.
And through my imprisonment, I have been able to actually advance the gospel in ways that I could have never advanced them if my plans were the plans that were being enacted. In other words, God had a better plan than my plan. And his plan yielded a greater progress for the gospel.
Amen.
That word progress is a really greater word in the Greek than it is in the English. It means more than just to move along, making progress, just moving along. It's the idea of moving along smack in the middle of obstacles, dangers, distractions. It's moving forward in spite of resistance, moving forward, making progress against opposition. Progress against anything that might hinder the advance. So Paul is saying the gospel is advancing against all obstacles. What are those? My circumstances. Through my circumstances, through my bad circumstances, a greater good is being realized. I was reading a very, very, very old commentary. Some of you may know of this. Maybe you even own it. It's written back in the late 1600s. Anyone own a commentary from the 1600s called Matthew Henry? Oh, yeah. Matthew Henry's commentaries, classic old things. But he wrote a commentary on Philippians, and on verse 12, this is what he writes. When Paul says, my circumstances have turned out for the greater progress for the gospel, Henry says, Paul is claiming that God is the only alchemist. That's very 1600s, isn't it? Yeah. God is the only alchemist. What is an alchemist? Well, back in the Middle Ages, the alchemist had one prime concern, and that was to find the secret of turning lead into gold. That would be good. They viewed lead as completely worthless and totally useless, so the alchemist set out to find a process of turning lead into gold. And they never found one. But Henry is saying that Paul is saying here that God does that all the time.
Amen.
With the circumstances in your life. That's the lead. I was also reading about John Bunyan a little bit this week, and he wrote Pilgrim's Progress, written about the same time as Matthew Henry wrote all those commentaries in the late 1600s. Before he wrote Pilgrim's Progress, John Bunyan, he was a very great, well-known preacher. And his preaching was so powerful to the point of almost being obnoxious. And it was so powerful that it actually landed him in jail, the Bedford jail, just to shut him up. But he preached the sermons nonstop from his jail cell, screaming at the top of his lungs, and you could hear his preaching outside of the walls of the jail. And what happened is crowds and crowds of people came every day to listen to him. And they had to put a kibosh to this. This is not what we want. So what did they do? They put him deep inside the basement of the jail, where no one could hear him. And you know what he did? For that whole time, it gave him the opportunity to write Pilgrim's Progress. They thought they'd silence the preacher.
Yes.
But instead, it gave him time, and it gave him the opportunity to actually write, which has since been read and even preached to millions and millions of people, which is an incredible gospel story, generation to generation. That's how it is. Reminds you of another story, doesn't it? Maybe in the Old Testament, Joseph. Remember that? The brothers sell Joseph off into slavery, and they're wanting to get rid of them, and they say something like, finally, that's the last we're ever going to see of this guy. And of course, Joseph, he prays to God. He says, why are you letting this happen? What God did was he turned lead into gold.
Yes.
Because Joseph, what happens to him? He eventually becomes the prime minister. And he eventually saves the brothers.
Yes.
And that classic verse in Genesis 50:20, as for you, talking to his brothers, you meant it for evil against me. But God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. And of course, the brothers were saved. That is exactly what happened here with Paul.
Amen.
Paul could look at his captors and say, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. The furtherance of the gospel of Jesus Christ. So what specifically happened that was so good? What was the progress of the gospel? Two things. The advance of the gospel outside of the church and the advance of the gospel inside of the church. Let's first look at the outside of the church. This is the bigger of the 2 points. Back to verse 12. Now I want you to know, brethren, that my circumstances have turned out for the greater progress of the gospel. But listen to this. So that my imprisonment in the cause of Christ has become well known through the whole Praetorian Guard and everyone else. Praetorian Guard could be Imperial Guard, could be Palace Guard. These are the high-end, very special guards. Now stay with me here, because I think this is absolutely amazing.
Yes.
Everyone, it says, knows that Paul is a prisoner, not because he committed a crime, but because he preached Christ. Okay?
Yes.
Everyone. Now in Acts 28, we find out some details about Paul's imprisonment. It's really amazing. You see, Paul was not in a normal prison. He actually was in a private residence. He actually paid rent to live there. And we're calling it prison. People were allowed to come and go as he wanted and as they pleased. And they did. By voluminous amounts of people. He could have visitors. But don't think that this was some cushy situation. Because in Acts 28:20 it says Paul was bound in chains. Now specifically, this chain is a very special chain. There's many kinds of chains, but this is a halucis chain, and that was a very short chain. It's about 18 inches long, and it would be placed over the wrist of the prisoner and then would be attached to a soldier. 18 inches. That's pretty tight. That's just about face to face, isn't it? And Paul was bound to a soldier. How much of the time that he was there? 24 hours a day. 24 hours a day. There would be 4 soldiers. They would each do shifts of 6 hours. So Paul would have 4 different soldiers every 6 hours for the 24-hour period. Well, escape was impossible, not to mention privacy. Can you imagine? Night and day attached to this soldier. There's no privacy in everything that you do. And this went on for 2 years.
Wow.
Think about that. And what was the result of that? Get this. The cause of Christ has become well known through the whole Praetorian Guard.
Amen.
Think about that. You got to ask, who was the prisoner? Was it Paul or was it the soldiers? Think about it. How tough it would be to be chained to Paul for 6 hours, 18 inches between you. How tough that would have been for a soldier to be chained to him. Have you ever tried to share the gospel with someone who wants to get away? These guys couldn't. Imagine being chained for him. I can't imagine. What an incredible missionary opportunity.
Yes.
Paul did not plan that. God did.
Yes.
You know that you got to imagine, I mean, there's a church that's forming in Rome right then, and I'm sure that there were Christians that were specifically praying, oh God, help us somehow to reach Caesar's household. Help us to somehow reach the elite Praetorian Guard, because there is no way we can ever reach these people. Help us, God, do some miracle, because there is no way in. And guess what? There is. And God, in his wonderful wisdom, made the whole Praetorian Guard captive to Paul for 6 hours intervals. I think it's amazing.
Yes.
And he evangelized them all. Read the last chapter of Acts. He preached unhindered. What do you suppose Paul talked about day and night? An earful, I know. And not only that, they would see his character.
Yes.
They would see the kind of man who he really was. Not just his preaching, but they would see that he actually does what he preaches. His temperament. And they would see the peace that was inside of him. And guess what else they would see? His joy.
Right.
His passion for the gospel. Human circumstances lay in the hands of God, and he uses them to advance his agenda.
Right.
Paul's difficult circumstances advanced the gospel. And the Praetorian Guard was being converted. How do I know that? Listen to the very end of Philippians chapter 4, verse 22. It says, he's closing his letter, and I think he's closing it with a little tongue-in-cheek. Because he says, all the saints greet you, especially those in Caesar's household. Not just the Praetorian Guard, but Caesar's household. And then don't miss the everyone else that it says in verse 13. What does that mean? It means everyone else. Certainly everybody else in the palace, but I think it means everybody else in Rome. Because I think that he was turning Rome upside down. The house was open to visitors and they thronged in. The guards are talking. The guards are changing. And what did he do? Day and night he preached and he taught the gospel of Jesus Christ.
Amen.
And that's how God used Paul to evangelize Rome. The gospel is spreading outside of the church, but it also tells us it was spreading inside of the church. Look at verse 14. It says, and that most of the brethren, these would be fellow Christians there in Rome, that most of the brethren, trusting in the Lord because of my imprisonment, have far more courage to speak the word of God without fear. You see, apparently many had come to Christ because of Paul's imprisonment, and now we've got this church that's forming in Rome, and I would imagine that they were a little bit reluctant themselves to start spreading the gospel because they might get thrown in jail also. But seeing the fruits of Paul's imprisonment, seeing that some of Caesar's household is actually coming to Christ, seeing how God protected Paul every time he opened up his mouth while being chained, seeing how respected Paul was with the soldiers and the effect that he was having on them had given them the courage to share and to speak the word.
Wow.
So even inside of the church, Paul's imprisonment affected greatly. And if God could minister through Paul in his condition, his circumstances, God could minister through all of them just as well. And so Paul's strength became their strength. What an incredible truth.
Yes.
Through one man seemingly sidelined for ministry. His plans are not being a reality, removed from the mission field as far as everybody else is concerned. A plethora of misfortune and terrible experiences saturated his life from the moment he planned his ministry. And even now, it says there are people that are trying to derail his ministry while he's in prison. Look at verse 15. Some, to be sure, these are the ones that have come to Christ. Some are preaching Christ even from envy and strife, but some also from goodwill. The latter do it out of love, knowing that I am appointed for the defense of the gospel, but the former proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition rather than from pure motives, thinking to cause me distress in my imprisonment. I mean, it never lets up. There is a hardness to life. So here is a man who has negative circumstances beyond our ability to really comprehend them and understand them, continuously chained to Roman soldiers, and yet, what is he a model of? He's a model of, look at verse 18. He says, what then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in this I rejoice.
Wow.
Yes, in this I rejoice. This is the secret. Mark that verse 18. I would underline it, I would highlight it, I would circle it. First of all, what then, he asks. What do you mean, what then? in light of my circumstances. The troubles that I'm having and I've had, the circumstances that I'm in, even the people that are still trying to distress me. In light of everything that is coming at me, he says, only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed. And in this I rejoice. Yes, I will rejoice. Paul is telling us, whether the hard things that you go through life refines you and turns you into gold, from lead to gold, depends on your definition of life. That's the alchemy. If lead, your circumstances, is going to be turned into gold, depends on what is most important to you in life. And the secret is in the first few words of verse 19. For I know that this will turn out for my deliverance through your prayers and the provision of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, according to my earnest expectation and hope that I will not be put to shame in anything, but that with all boldness Christ will even now as always be exalted in my body, whether by life or by death. What gives Paul his joy? It is what Paul has placed his heart completely on. That's the thing that he gets up in the morning for. It's the passion for which he lives. And it isn't his work. It isn't his family. It's not his friends. It's not making money. It's Jesus Christ. Verse 21, for to me to live is Christ. That's it. That is Paul's definition of life. And if you have the proper definition of life, you can go through anything. And you can face everything. And Paul says, for me to live. In other words, this is the thing that makes life for me. This is my bottom line. This is the most important thing to me. This is the passion for which I live. If I have this, then I am living. Regardless of what is taken away from me, regardless of what comes at me, what is done to me, what's inflicted to me. On Wednesday nights, we've been looking at different secular worldviews. These are the worldviews that we all run into every day in our culture. It's been a great time. I wish all of you could have come. And how would the different worldviews answer that question? What is the passion for which you live? Just going down the list of the ones we've been looking at, and going to be looking at this Wednesday night, and some are going to say, well, for me to live is to have fun. That's just it. Have pleasure. They might work hard, but they're only working hard for the purpose of making a lot of money so that they can have a good time, so that they can play. They work hard because they can make enough money and then they can do the things that they think is really giving their life meaning. Recreation, experience. You know, the new boat to play on the river, the airplane tickets to experience the world, and every toy in the world to experience every thrill in the world. And that's the hedonist approach to finding meaning in life. Some live for power and control. Power and control are just so important to them, so vital to them. The meaning of life for them is to be strong. It's to be self-sufficient and to be in charge, to be in power over others. For some, it is really to be a good person. A lot of people that don't know Jesus want to be good people. Morality is their reason for living. I need to know I'm a good person. I don't know how many of you have ever read Les Miserables. It's a great book. It's a long book. At least see the movie, or the Broadway play, or whatever. But it's a great classic by Victor Hugo. And you have these, well, you have many characters, as Victor Hugo always does, but the main character, Valjean. He was a condemned criminal, and he did some petty theft, stealing for the provisions of his family years ago, but he's now on the run continuously throughout the whole book. And then you have this relentless police inspector, Javert, who is after Valjean. I mean, it's a driven force in his life to have justice come on Valjean. But it's interesting because Javert eventually takes his own life. He commits suicide. Why? Because he could not stand the idea of Valjean, in actuality, was a better man than he was. This one-time criminal actually had more goodness in him than he had. He could not stand that idea that he needed forgiveness and that he needed grace. By the way, the book is full of spiritual, biblical imagery. It's a wonderful book. But it was such a drive for him to be seen as a good person, a right person, a just person. And to see himself as a good person was everything to him, and he realized he wasn't, so he killed himself. But you know, most people choose other things to give life definition. Family, their children, friends, career, spouse. For me, to live is to have that. For me, it is my children. My whole life, I am pouring out into my children because they are the most important thing to me. I am completely for them, or my grandchildren. For me, it is my spouse. I have given my entire adult life over to my spouse. We do everything together. We breathe in the same cadence. And the problem with all of those is that all of them can be stripped away from you. The bottom line of your life, if it is other than Jesus Christ, can be taken from you. And if your joy is linked to something that you could lose, you may lose it all. Right. What is your bottom line? Is it something you can lose? And you will lose it, possibly. And where's your life? Well, it's not too good unless you jump to another bottom line. And if you don't do that, you're done. Your life collapses. Paul says there is only one definition in life that stands up to anything and everything. There is nothing in the world that can come at this and remove it from you. It is the only thing that if you build your life on can withstand anything and everything that is thrown at you.
Amen.
And that's Jesus Christ.
Yes.
And it is so very sad, and I see it all the time, see lives that are completely falling apart because they might lose a child. I mean, their lives are completely over. They get divorced, and their whole life is centered on that child. And if your life collapses, when your love collapses, it means that your loves were your life. And the problem with your life is not your circumstances, but it is your definition of life. For me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. Paul's career was kaput. He couldn't be a church planter anymore. Paul's freedom to move around had been completely taken away from him. Paul's not allowed to travel to the churches that he set up. He can't even hardly talk to them. Even his life at any moment might be taken away from him because Caesar might decide you are too much of a trouble. So what does Paul say? He says, live, die. Since my life is defined as being in Jesus Christ, nothing else really matters in the long run of things. I live, great. I die, great. It doesn't matter because I'm going to spend eternity with Jesus Christ.
Yes.
Paul's joy in life exists completely outside of his circumstances. Have you ever thought about this? Do you ever sit down and just really think about your life in these terms? Do you wonder why your joy ebbs and flows, rises and falls, depending on what's coming at you? Have you ever stopped to evaluate what it is that you're defining your life with? I mean, most of us in this room, we would say, of course, Jesus is the most important thing in my life. Because we were taught to say that in Sunday school, and we know that's the right answer. And we're not afraid to say that, but is he really?
Yeah.
You look at Paul's life and his amazing life, and you think, well, that's Paul. God told him to go out into the mission field, share the gospel, and then write most of the New Testament. This is not your normal guy. We would expect Paul to behave and believe and do these things, but I can't share the gospel the way that he did. I can't teach the word like he did because I'm stuck in my job. Think about that. So I think that's interesting. Are you chained to your desk? Are you chained to the sales counter that you're responsible for? Are you chained to the tools that you have to use every day to do your job? Are you chained to that computer that you are on all day, every day? Are you chained to the car that you have to drive to go on those meetings with your clients? Are you chained to the classroom? What are you chained to? Paul was chained to smelly soldiers in the Roman army. And as a result, Rome received the gospel.
Right.
What are you chained to? Bad excuse. Paul's joy was tied to Christ.
Yes.
Often he said, I am a prisoner of Jesus Christ. Is your joy tied to him? Let's pray. Heavenly Father, what a great book this is. What a great example that we have to look upon. A very real person that explains and demonstrates so well what it means to be a Spirit-filled Christian. A Christian who has a joy that cannot be extinguished. A joy that is based and founded on being in you. I just pray that we all embrace this message of Philippians. I pray for changed lives. I pray for encouragement. And I pray that true joy can be embraced as we move through these great chapters. We give you all the praise and glory in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Pastor. Would you please stand?